Let me pray. Ask the Lord to watch over our time together. Father, we do thank you so much that we can call you our Father because of your Son, Jesus. We thank you, Lord, for all that you do for us, things that we know about and things that we don't even know about that you're doing in our lives and protecting and keeping us. We just pray, Lord, that you'll watch over our technology and pray if there's any issues going on with Maureen right now that you would take care of those. And she's just joined us. Thank you, Father. Just pray that.
I joined from 4:30 and I waited for 1 hour and 15 minutes.
Oh, well, I just prayed that the Lord would help you join us, and then you were right here. So thank you, Father. We thank you so much. It's in Jesus' name I'm praying. Amen.
Yes, and I couldn't understand. I called everybody in the world.
Oh,
I
my.
have no number for you, none for Dr. Henry,
Yeah.
none for anyone, and I didn't get the impression that we were changing permanently to 7:30.
Oh, my. Yeah. Oh, I got on here right at about maybe 25 after, so I was a little late getting on. So you might have come on and then gone off, and then we all came on. So
you mean 25 minutes past 7 you came on?
I did, yes.
No, I came at 4:34 because I thought we were meeting at 4:30.
Interesting.
Yeah. I don't remember that we had said it was going to be permanent. I thought it was just because of last week when I asked for it to change.
Oh, no, we're going to stay with the 7:30 time at this point.
That's fine. That's fine by me. I just didn't know that it was agreed.
Okay, yeah. Let's go.
Give me 1 minute, please. 1 minute.
Okay. All right, I've got the tape recorder going. Let me just ask if there's any issues right now that we can answer quickly before we kind of jump into some of our current issues. I know you've been working on your research questions and trying to fill in some of the sections there of your chapter 1. And I can say if there's any specific issues we can maybe answer right now, we could possibly do that.
The assignment for looking at the 2 articles, I seem to have been getting my things mixed up. I didn't even realize that was given outside of when I saw the comment from you.
Oh.
You had written something about doing the 2 articles and so on, but then when I looked at it in the BGU copy, I realized that I must have missed it. I don't know. Was it always there about looking at the 2 articles?
Yeah.
So I haven't even found 2 articles. I was doing the wrong thing. I actually was reading a book from care.com. That's what it is. It's a book written about different stories of women who have done different entrepreneurial ventures. So I think I'm going to have to find some other kind of article to satisfy the inquiry.
Yeah, actually, we'd kind of like you to find 2 journal articles, not a book, but just find 2 journal articles. Okay. Good. All right. Yeah. And then, I mean, when you started the course, I think I had you look up 10 articles, and you could pick one of those if you want. We're mainly just trying to give you practice, is looking at an article, trying to determine what you think the author's problem statement was, what do you think the author's research questions were, and then just trying to determine how that might relate to your own project topic. So it's just mainly a practice session as you look at those 2 research articles.
Yeah, we need them because questions won't come easy.
Okay, all right. Okay, what I'm trying to do is I give you comments. I'm also, I'm trying to give you some feedback on, what the way you're organizing the project, and then just even on some of the APA issues. I know you have to kind of learn some of these APA formatting issues, the way you do parenthetical documentation, etc. So I'm hoping just as you're kind of working through these, this chapter, this introduction chapter, and make the comments to you, that you'll start to kind of understand some of those little fine points of formatting that you need to do for a dissertation. And it doesn't always come easy, I understand that. But we'll just keep working at that, as well as the actual content of those chapters. Well, what we're going to do, I'm going to jump in, I think. I'll go ahead and give a little bit of a presentation. It'll kind of finish out the purpose statement. And then I've asked Dr. Henry just to give a couple more things on definitions and some of those other sections that we would be filling out for that chapter 1. But let me just make a few comments on that last section of the purpose statement. As you remember, in that purpose statement, we kind of have an introduction paragraph or two that we call the intent. And then that second section is the research questions that you've been working on. And then the third section of that purpose statement is just called the transformational strategy that you are going to be developing for your project. I think I'll go ahead and share my screen. What I'm going to do, I think, is I'm going to just share the document. That you do have access to this document, but I put in a few comments, and I'll just make some comments, I think, on that document. So this is under the week 4, week 5. Actually, I guess we're going to be in week 5 for this document. But anyway, the last section of your project is of the purpose statement, is this transformational strategy section. And I'm just going to read a couple things here just as I get started. The final section of the purpose statement is entitled Transformational Strategy. As you've heard before, all BGU dissertation projects must culminate in some type of a practical strategy to begin to address the problem identified in your dissertation. Examples of transformational strategies from past dissertations have included city consultations, asset-based community development programs, training seminars, multimedia events, organizational assessments, and many others. But the idea is that in a BGU project, the research that you do is not just for the sake of the research alone. We want to make sure that we're doing excellent research, but that research is also meant to support some kind of a strategy that you are going to be developing to address the problem issue, begin to address the problem issue in some specific way. Like Noel is dealing with teen pregnancy there in his area. We know that just one strategy that he will develop is not going to solve teen pregnancy, but we do want to begin to see that you are thinking about some practical ways that you can you join in the efforts to address a particular issue in your particular area. And so, like I said, training seminars, multimedia events, a lot of different practical strategies that people have used. I just finished an oral review with a student over in Vietnam, and his project, he called it Love Hanoi. He's in Hanoi, and he put together a project that has just had amazing transformational results in the capital of Vietnam, Hanoi, bringing together about 150 churches to begin to work together on some of the specific issues that have been going on in Hanoi. As they've kind of come through some of the transitions they've come through over the last 30 years. But he actually had two issues. He did a lot of research to see what churches had been doing in terms of community development, community activities. And he brought together a network of churches who then sponsored a huge evangelistic effort where over 30,000 people came to the Lord. And so it was the first ever of that kind of an event in Hanoi, Vietnam, which of course has been, under a communist regime for many years. But we just saw the Lord doing some phenomenal work. But, he did some research in terms of seeing what churches were doing before some of the events that they were involved in. Did a lot of interviewing to see how they were involved in their communities, or were they involved in their communities in any specific ways. They went through a series of events together. And now there's something called God's Love in Action Network. And so now, like I say, about 150 churches are involved in doing some endeavors together to make their community better. And so it's been pretty amazing work that he's doing there. But since that's kind of fresh on my mind, I just did that oral review with him and his team just this end of this last week. But that was an intervention strategy that he had been involved in Hanoi, trying to bring churches together for efforts that they could work on as a team in their community, which actually had not happened before. So we're looking for some kind of a practical strategy. Something I'm just going to run you through a few things here. I sometimes ask students to ask themselves these questions. You know, what is the situation now? What would the situation look like if the problem were solved? What beginning steps do you need to take to begin to address the problem? And what are other people with whom you can network? Who are other people that you might network with in order to address the issue? We do stress at BGU collaboration. We really do want you to be networking with others in your community as you begin to address issues together. And so, you know, all that is part of a transformational strategy. Some of you may be familiar with SWOT analysis, which is used in many business communities. SWOT simply stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You know, a strength, you know, what does an organization or a community or you as a person do best? You need to analyze that. Weaknesses, you know, what are the weak areas in yourself, in your community, in what you're trying to accomplish? What are the opportunities? What opportunities exist to help address the problem? And then threats, what potential issues can negatively impact the problem? So that's a SWOT analysis. So as you're thinking about your situation, you know, you might think about, you know, what are the strengths and the opportunities that you could take advantage of right now? You know, Noel, you've got I guess a radio program, TV program. You know, that's an opportunity to begin to address the issue of teen pregnancy. Thinking about, you know, looking at your own situation and what are the opportunities that you can see right now that could possibly be avenues that you could use to find some practical ways of addressing the issue, you know, after you've come through the research part of your dissertation. You've also got to be aware of, you know, what are some of the potential threats or downfalls or weaknesses that will make it more difficult. You know, as you, Maureen, you're kind of dealing with the whole issue of women in entrepreneurship. You've mentioned even how some of the evangelical worldview in your area could be a hindrance. Okay, so that could be a weakness or a threat to what you're trying to do in terms of entrepreneurialism. But there's also probably some opportunities that you'll be looking for to address that issue in some way. Same kind of issues. It's thinking about your network. Ryan is working at the whole issue of looking at possibly some representative companies and trying to understand, you know, their values, how their values possibly match or don't match with some of their clients. Some opportunities would just be learning to know who's in a network of your particular current network of people that you can even begin to talk with and collaborate with. So yeah, those are opportunities as we're kind of thinking about our projects. If you've been at BGU for any length of time, you've heard the term appreciative inquiry, and you know the appreciative inquiry is simply an approach to working with whatever it happens to be, an issue in a community or an organization, whatever it might be. And we talk about the 5 Ds in appreciative inquiry as that model has been developed to improve organizations, to improve communities. Some students have actually organized whole endeavors in their communities using this kind of an approach. But, the 5 Ds: definition, selecting the area of concern to be addressed. You've pretty much done that at this point in time. You have a problem statement. Discovery, determining how people see an issue, discovering people and other resources that can be helpful in addressing the issue. That's all part of your research as we're trying to understand how people are thinking about a particular issue, for example. The dream stage of the appreciative inquiry is imagining what might be as people and resources are brought together for a positive result. So, as you're thinking about your project, dreaming what could, just asking, and I think this is done in prayer, asking the Lord, what could be here? How would you like to use me in terms of making a difference in relationship to this issue that I'm addressing? The design is developing the processes and the activities needed to effectively bring about a positive result. You may be, I think you've talked about, Maureen, possibly maybe designing some kind of a training curriculum that might be useful in helping women learn entrepreneurial skills. That would be part of a design of a practical strategy. And then the destiny of the delivery is implementing the needed processes. It's so the implementation of the design that's needed to effectively bring about some kind of a positive change. So just a few quick comments there in terms of, as you're thinking about your particular topic and situation, you're thinking about a transformational strategy that you can implement and test to see how effective it might be. And, every dissertation is going to include an evaluation section in your research methodology chapter, and we'll be talking about that more in a few weeks. But, you in the evaluation section, you're evaluating just how well and how valid, for example, you think the research has gone. Do you believe that the research was valid in terms of the kind of data and the way you were able to analyze that data? Was it skewed in some way, and you'd need to be looking at that? So you're looking at the research side of the project. In the evaluation, you're also looking at this transformational strategy aspect of the project. How well did it accomplish what you wanted to accomplish? You may have some feedback forms or interviews that you would do after, say, doing a seminar or something. So you're collecting levels of evaluation in that way in regards to your transformational strategy. Just kind of this little diagram at the end is kind of what oftentimes we use it in some business, but it's these three, as any project is coming together, we're thinking about, how much time it's going to take. If you're doing this in a for-profit or non-profit organization, you may be interested in the cost and, of course, the scope. And the idea is you expand any one of these 3 items, it's going to affect the other 2. Like if I expand the scope of my project, it's going to involve more time. It might involve more cost. On the other hand, if I expand time and I'm able to devote more time to a particular issue, then I'm able to expand the scope. And then though, if it's going to involve some financial outlay, I've got to determine, okay, will that factor be involved? So just some issues, and this sheet will be on the under the files area in that week that you can kind of look at as you're kind of thinking about your transformational strategy. So let me just stop there and just say any questions you'd like to ask at this point in time. I know some of you have already started doing some thinking about that. You've included some thoughts about a transformational strategy, but I'd like you to kind of really think about that even more closely, using some of these guidelines to think through a transformational strategy that you would like to implement. And it's also important as you're thinking even about this strategy, what kind of research do you need to support this kind of a strategy? Go ahead. Someone was going to talk.
That's me. The word strategy seem to have a different meaning and effect or impact on different persons. So I had a long talk with my I have a main person from my PLC who we talk constantly about my work, and she looks at it. So my question is, can we have one strategy, or do we have to have several strategies?
No, I mean, you may end up having, 2 or 3 strategies if you have time to work on those. I just mentioned the Hanoi project. Now that particular, they've been working on that for a couple of years. They put together 2 conferences. They put together several workshops that went on over a several months period of time. They'd actually established a couple of community projects that they were working on, a neighborhood cleanup project, a few others. All these were developing out of this Showing God's Love in Action network that developed as a result of this person's project. So yeah, you may have, again, remember that triangle though, it depends on, if you expand the scope of your transformational strategy or strategies, you're gonna need more time in order to possibly make that happen. I think I mentioned on your project, you had talked about a training curriculum. You'd also mentioned a few other ideas, some kinds of clubs and and how banks might get involved. The issue is you need to determine what's actually going to happen within the time frame of your dissertation project.
Okay, so my understanding, right, is that this is from my point of view from this project, this study. So I'm saying that mine is an educational strategy, okay?
Right.
And in an educational strategy, these are some things, some activities that will be planned in order to get to what we consider, important outcomes, okay? So for example, the idea of business clubs is not something that will necessarily happen in the time of this research project, because
right.
Those business clubs are intended to be for help and support in a continual way. It's a place where people will be able to always come for support, for mentoring and that sort of thing, okay? And this is not a very original model, but it's something I'm trying to borrow from an organization I have done work for. But that was for every and anybody. And as a matter of fact, it was for just a particular age group. But my focus is on the church, okay?
Right.
So it's not like it's such an original model. It is just that trying to innovate using something that happened elsewhere for a particular clientele, and that is Christian women. All right. So my friend was saying that the various things that I have, she didn't see them as strategies. She just thought it's just one educational focus. All right. I thought that I had one educational focus, but then along the way, there are other things that could become another strategy. You understand?
Right. For this, for this dissertation project, let's say then you're going to focus on one strategy, which in your case, say you're going to create a curriculum that you're going to try out maybe in at least one church and get some feedback on how well that particular curriculum accomplished what you want.
And it may not be in one church, but it could be in one region, meaning...
And that would be fine too. Yeah, I mean, you could
about collaborating.
Right.
We have a lot of small churches.
Right. So you could
could very well have a program that will affect 10 small churches in a very small region.
Right. So you could find a place that you're going to do that kind of a seminar.
Yes.
And you invite, people from 10 different churches. And that's fine. Yeah, you're going to work with 10 different churches to try. That's probably good, because then you're going to get even more exposure to those different churches, and you'll be able to get better feedback in terms of how well it was accomplishing and how well it was received. Yeah. What I was going to say, though, you had many other good ideas in the dissertation, in the discussion chapter, which is in the actual dissertation will be chapter 5. There's a place to talk about anticipated future events, strategies, and that's really where you'll talk about some of the other ideas you'd have for the future that you hope will possibly be taking place. You could mention them now, even in the intent. You could say, here's what I'm going to do through this particular dissertation project. For the future, here's my hope that some of these other kinds of endeavors may be able to take place after this dissertation project is completed. But the idea is to have a start and a stop time for this project, okay? And you determine what you can accomplish within this particular project in terms of the research that you can do and the transformational strategy that you can implement and test. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay. Other thoughts, questions? Okay. Well, let's keep going. If you think of questions along the way, that'll be fine. That will pretty much finish out the purpose statement section, the intent, the research questions, and the transformational strategy. There's a few other sections within that chapter 1, assumptions and worldview of the researcher, definitions section, delimitations and limitations. And we're going to maybe talk about a few of those other sections right now, so you can maybe have some good advice in order to keep finishing out that chapter 1. So, Dr. Henry, what can you contribute to this to those areas from your perspective? And I've stopped sharing my screen, so any screens that you'd like to share, that'd be great.
Okay, I do have a handout that I will put in the course outline, but I'm going to go back to this presentation that I had done a few weeks ago and pull out on the assumptions, definitions, delimitations, etc. Because it's a PowerPoint. I tend to prefer to work with a PowerPoint, but I'll so let's see. Let's see. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the delimitations. Okay, limitations, assumptions. Okay. Let's start with the assumptions. There are two perspectives on the assumptions of the study. There are the assumptions that you bring to the study in terms of your biases. And then there are assumptions that you need to be able to bring to the study as a result of your knowledge of the research literature. Merriam and Tidswell state that the researcher needs to make explicit the assumptions with which they come to the study. You do not come to the study as a blank slate. you do come to the study with some ideas, with some expectations, etc. And in good research, it is important that you be transparent, and that transparency includes your willingness to identify what are the biases that you bring to the study. And quoting from Marion and Tisdale, they say, what are your biases? What should we know about you as the researcher that will help us to understand how you are approaching the study and how you might be interpreting the data? What are you going to be sensitive to, and so forth? What is your relationship to the topic on the investigation? That's very important. So what I'd like each of you to do right now is to identify one or two assumptions that you are coming to your study with. Anybody can start. Thank you, Maureen.
I thought that I had written that we're not supposed to have gone down that far in the paper.
Actually, the assumptions, this is the beginning piece, because what you are saying, that you're basically saying why you are interested in this study. And part of the reason why you are interested in this study is that you have some biases. You have some preconceived ideas that you're bringing to the study. And what's important is that you identify those, because if you don't, it is likely that those biases will be reflected in how you do your study.
So I did write something.
Go ahead.
One of them was, it had to do with the whole thing about the incorrect approach to money.
Say that again, please.
I'm trying to look at my paper so that I have here. Okay. So I have, okay, good. Can I read it?
Sure.
Okay, so I have written, there may be several biases in mind. So far as this project is concerned, I believe
you're a little low. Can you?
The first thing that lingers in my mind is that Christians generally have a wrong approach to money, which comes from an incorrect quotation from the Bible. The quote is, money is the root of all evil, and the actual verse says, the love of money is the root of all evil. And then the next thing is, another bias would be a belief that some Christian women are afraid and so make excuses. These tendencies keep them from venturing beyond their comfort zones. Another one comes from the fact that the teaching of submission causes Christian women to be more laid back rather than be assertive. Women who are assertive are labeled negatively as being aggressive. And there is a teaching about a Jezebel spirit, which is misconstrued, so good Christian women would not dare to venture. So,
okay. I have some questions to ask about the assumptions that you've just listed for us. My question, and I read it, so I'm glad we could talk about it, is what is the link between what you say about money and the topic of interest? My understanding is that you want to look at women as entrepreneurs. So how then are you linking money and women as entrepreneurs?
Okay. Because you have persons who, when you speak to them, it's as if, they really don't care to earn much more than getting a salary. So, the encouragement that one would have to become self-employed and to have their own business and to create something that is larger than just being an employee does not interest them, because they're really not interested in money, in getting any more. They just want to just be able to get by and maybe have a little saving and so on, you know. I remember one time having a conversation with someone, and she said, you know, I don't need anything more than I already have. And this is someone who was very educated and had a lot of technical competence and so on. So I recognize that for her, she said, me owning a business, no. In other words, it's like it was unheard of because she was content and so on, you know. So
Okay. May I suggest a way to rephrase that assumption as I listen to you? This is what I think I'm hearing you say. Because what's important is that we must see the direct link between the assumption and the topic. It seems to me that one of the assumptions that you come to the study with is that people equate the entrepreneurship or being an entrepreneur with wealth or with having excess money.
yes,
Of course, that is not necessarily true, but that seems to be an assumption that you're bringing to the study. And the reason why it's important that we bring that assumption to the fore is that you are likely to design your study to reflect that assumption. But being an entrepreneur is much more than earning money. There is such a thing, and this is where you'll have to go into the literature. There is such a thing as what we call the entrepreneurial spirit. There are people who may never be rich, may never earn as much money as somebody who's a wage earner, but they have spent their lives being entrepreneurial. So I'm just showing you how bringing out your assumptions is important, and the distinction that you need to make between what is a personal assumption, which is valid, but and an assumption that is based on the research literature. That's where I'm pushing you to think. Okay, so I appreciate your sharing that as one example of assumption that you have. Ryan or Noel, could you jump in and give one assumption that you have of your study, that you bring to your study? Ryan or Noel, any one of you, just jump right in.
Are you hearing me now?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Well, the one assumption I'm bringing to, well, maybe two, I'm bringing to the table is that the adoption of the community to this whole teenage pregnancy. First, there's anger, and then there's this whole embracing or adoption. And the second aspect that I am bringing is the whole aspect of the male absence. The male absence, having participated, is nowhere to be found. So those are two of the things that I am bringing to this this research.
Two assumptions. And again, like I said to Maureen, I would ask you to flesh that out some more in terms of teenage pregnancy. For example, you mentioned what you call the adoption of the community. The adoption of the community.
Yeah, you heard everything because my internet kind of froze a little bit. You heard everything that I said?
Yes, I think I did. No.
Okay, yes.
Correct me.
The adoption or the embracing of the community.
Okay.
To this,
so
these pregnancies.
I would ask you to flesh that out some more.
Freeze again.
What is it about the adoption of the community to teenage pregnancy that impacts the occurrence of teenage pregnancy? So I'm saying to you, you need to flesh that out some more.
His internet went down.
It looks like Noel's having some problems with his internet going up and down.
Okay.
Are you hearing us okay, Noel?
He says he cannot hear us.
Must not be hearing us. Okay.
Oh, he's not hearing us. Okay.
Yeah, he's come back. You can see him moving now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead. You can hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
I'm hearing you a little bit, so I missed all of what you said before.
Okay, what I'm saying is I want you to flesh out what you just said about the community's acceptance of teenage pregnancy. What does that mean to the study?
Okay. For me, I am really trying to find out why the sudden change. Because in the first instant, when the news is broken about the pregnancy, everybody is the anger and everything starts. But when during the process, the progress of the pregnancy going to birth, changes occur. They're no longer angry, and now they embrace the new infant. And I am trying to understand why is it that this change, you were first hungry, why were you hungry? And you're now happy, why are you happy? And the other aspect of it that I'm trying to understand is why, like say about 50%, 60% of the male, why when the news is broken, they disappear.
Okay.
Or they disappear. And then they come back at a later date, or some of them never come back.
Okay.
Let
me suggest that, and this is where now I push you towards looking at the literature.
Yeah.
That there are psychosocial explanations for what you have just described. There are psychosocial explanations for what you have just described.
Yes.
You've heard about death and dying, and people talk about the stages of grief that people go through when there's death or when there's a loss.
Yes, yes.
I want to suggest that in the same way, when people are dealing with challenging social issues, they go through stages of, but for want of a better term right now, I use the word grief. And so what you've just described to me fits that pattern, but don't take my word for it. I want to suggest to you that in literature, that there's research literature that will help you to understand that. So what I'm saying is that your assumption is valid, and that out of that assumption, you may be pushed to look at the situation through certain lenses. And that is why it's important that when you come to research, you make clear what are your personal assumptions, because that's where you begin, but then you also link those personal assumptions to what the literature may be saying about those same assumptions that you have, because then they help you to narrow the scope of your study and go in a particular direction that is valid, okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Ryan, could you share with us what one assumption that you bring to your study?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
One, actually, I guess it'll be two parts that companies say that their customers are their primary focus and that their employees are part of their family. However, they act in contrary to that, whereas their primary focus is profit. Employees are a means to the end.
Mm-hmm.
And then employees, likewise, don't see companies as a home or a place where they can grow, whereas it's just a place where they can make money.
Okay, that's pretty clear. No, I would say to you, like I've said to Maureen and Noel, go to the literature now to see to what extent that assumption is supported in the research literature. Okay, from my own experience, when I did my doctoral research, I did a study of the Bible College as an adult education institution because adult education administration is my field of study. I started out my study assuming that the Bible College administrators, the board members, the students were one, unaware of the theory of adult education, and two, if they were, they would not see it as a valid means by which you would do Bible college education. That assumption was not borne out by my research findings. In fact, I was very surprised at when I did the interviews, etc. I did a qualitative study. I did the study of the documents, the historical records, etc. I was very surprised at how much people were aware of adult education theory and practice as valid towards how we do Bible college education. I'm saying that to show you how sometimes you can start out with an assumption and be very convinced that you are right, but your research could show you differently. So that is why you always have to go to research with an open mind to let the data speak to you rather than you try to force the data to match the assumptions that you enter into the study with. That's my point. But I would say further, because my assumption was disproven by the study, I was able, as an administrator in that institution, to bring changes to the institution that made it line up more with being an adult education institution. Because that openness was already there. So that's my point there. Okay, so we've talked about assumptions. I just want to say, to quote what Sensing says about assumptions. Sensing said that these should be stated concisely and listed in a meaningful order. And then he encourages researchers to make what he calls tacit assumptions explicit. And that's what I just had you do in this exercise. I wanted you to bring to the fore those tacit assumptions that have caused you to be interested in doing your study. That's very important. And then he quotes another research. He says, examine, and this is the piece that I want us to remember about research. Examine your emotional reactions to the setting, the study, and the participants. If you do not, your feelings will still the research process, but you will not know it. In other words, one of the pieces about assumptions that we need to be aware of is that when we do research, we come to it with an emotional piece.
Dr. Henry, are we supposed to be seeing the slide? Because the slide hasn't changed.
No, it hasn't changed. Right, because I'm explaining it. It hasn't changed. So what I'm saying is that there's an emotional piece, and that's the piece that I call the passion that you bring to the research. And that passion is important, but passion can take you either way. If you come to the research with certain assumptions that you have not made explicit, and you are passionate about doing your study, it is likely, if you do not follow the guidelines about what it means to do research, the whole issue of objectivity. To be objective doesn't mean that you don't have passion and you don't have an emotional commitment. But what it does mean is that you are willing to put away the passion and the emotional commitment and allow the data to speak for itself. Excuse me. So that's the point I want to end with as we talk about assumptions. Research bias. And what we're saying is that's valid. It's not like if bias is negative. What would be a problem is if you're unaware of your bias, or if you allow your bias to guide your research endeavor to the point where you skew the research to give you the answers that you think should be given. That's where it becomes a problem. The next piece we want to talk about is the definition of terms. Okay, let's talk about delimitations. And I've pulled that one up. The delimitations of the study has to do with the scope of the study. What is the breadth of the study? We usually say that when at the beginning, any beginning process of research, the way you think about research is always way bigger than what you can do. So the challenge is to make your research manageable so that you can complete it within a certain time frame. So that is why the scope, the delimitation becomes important. Now, in either the qualitative or quantitative study, you will have to describe who are the subjects, who will be the participants in that study. You will have to describe how you will select them. That's important. How are they selected? Then you will have to describe the variables of the study. We've talked about the theoretical framework. Your variables come out of your theoretical framework. Now, I'm aware that in the qualitative studies, we don't start the qualitative study with a reference to variables, but you end this qualitative study with reference to variables, because as a result of the data that you get from your qualitative study, you are able to identify what are the key variables that going forward you need to test and examine some more. In the quantitative study, we start out with variables, because what we're doing in the quantitative study is we are testing the variables, we're measuring them, we're measuring the relationship between the variables, between the independent variable and the dependent variable, etc. Then the third thing about the scope, the delimitation, and this here, I know references the quantitative study, is a description of the tests, the instruments, and the procedures. What tests are you going to run to find the answers to your research questions? What instruments are you going to use? What procedures? In the quantitative study, those are usually made clear. Now, backing up a little in terms of the quantitative study, when you are testing the variables, one of the first things you do is you have to define your variables. And when you define your variables, it is always good to use definitions. You don't make up your own definition. You don't. You use definitions that are in the literature, that are recognized by other scholars. Now, when you define a variable, what you're doing is, we say you're operationalizing the variable, meaning you're defining it in such a way that it can be measured. So one of the things you do is that you go to those who are the key researchers in the area, and you use their definitions, because usually alongside their definitions, they have developed instruments that measure the variable. For example, I'm working with a student right now who is looking at the relationship between language proficiency, skills training, and self-esteem. Self-esteem is the dependent variable. And so the assumption is that the combination of language facility and skills ability will have a positive impact on self-esteem. Now, one of the key researchers in the area of self-esteem is Cooper Smith. His work is old, but it's a classic. So the definition that I've encouraged her to use, and she found that herself as she looked at the literature, is Cooper Smith's definition of self-esteem. Because alongside that definition of self-esteem, there's an instrument that Cooper Smith has developed that has been tested over and over again in all kinds of settings. And so she's going to use that instrument to measure the student's self-esteem. She's going to measure their self-esteem coming into the program. And then when they have done the study, she's going to use the same test to measure, to compare, to see if there has been an improvement in self-esteem as a result of the language proficiency and the skills training. So that's what we mean by testing and linking your testing to your variables, because what you're testing for is you're testing to measure the variable. How much is there or how much is not there. I hope this is making sense to you. Then there's description of special equipment. Again, in a quantitative study, you're looking at your tests and your instruments, and you have to make clear the exact procedures that you're going to use. Because one of the things that we say about a good quantitative study is that you should be able to replicate it using the same procedure. So that is important. And whatever special equipment is part of the study, that has to be described and identified. Then there may be need for training. For example, when you're running a test, you don't just assume that anybody can do a test, can supervise a test. You may have to train the people who are supervising the test so that they could administer it properly. So that's where training comes in. And then, of course, there's the time and duration of the study, and then there's the analytical procedures. I've given you this example using the quantitative kind of study. The same thing may apply differently if you're doing a qualitative study. Question, comment as we move on? Okay. The last one I want to look at is the limitations. And when we think of, sorry, Maureen, were you going to ask a question? Sorry.
It always takes time to get to that mute button.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just interested in that thing about the Cooper Smith classic definition of self-esteem and the instruments that was used. So you'd share the source or whatever.
Okay, I can send that information to you.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, limitations. When we talk about limitations of a study, we're talking about weaknesses. And so basically we're saying, like we said earlier about assumptions, that there is no such thing as a perfect research study. there are going to be weaknesses. Again, though, because one of the measures of good research is transparency, it is important that the researcher herself or himself is able to identify what are the weaknesses, or what are the inherent weaknesses, or what are the likely weaknesses of his or her research. And weaknesses could follow you in several different areas. For example, the approach that you use to do the study, the design, the method, the techniques, the sampling problems. How did you select the participants in the study? One of the things that we discourage students from doing when they, well, for both kinds of study, but especially in a quantitative study, we discourage people from using what we call a convenient sample, because there are disadvantages to using a convenient sample. For example, let's say you want to do a study on people's buying habits, and you decide that you're going to stand outside a business place and interview the people who come in and go out. That is an example of a convenient sample. To begin with, the people who are going in and out are the people who are buyers. So they are likely to match what you're looking for. That is a very bad example, but it is an example of a convenient sampling. So you have to be careful when you select the persons to participate in your research, that you identify the method of selection that you're going to use. And you certainly do not want it to be a convenient sampling approach. Then there's what we describe as uncontrolled variables. Usually when we look at variables, we look at them in terms of there being independent or dependent variables. But whatever variables underlie your study, you must be able to identify which group they fall into, and then of course you must be able to define them in a way that is measurable. Then there are errors in what we call test administration or data handling. The generalizability of data in good quantitative studies, one of the measures is that your study should be generalizable. Now, you can have a good study that is not necessarily generalizable, but that would represent a weakness of the study. It doesn't mean that the study doesn't have value, but what it means is that it's a one-off study. You can't take the results and say that it applies to any other group or any other context. Yeah. The representativeness of the subjects. For all three of you, that would be an important piece in terms of the participants of your study. I know, well, Maureen has made it clear, and that is valid, that her sample would be Christian women. So we know that you've already delineated your group, and that's fine. Then there's what we call compromises to internal or external validity, the issue of reliability and validity of the research instruments, etc. Once again, this example comes from quantitative research, but it's applicable to qualitative studies. Mm-hmm. Question, comments?
I was trying to find out if one example of a convenience study would be one including your friends and family. Your mic is still off, Dr. Henry.
I'm sorry. Yes, if in your study you limit yourself. Could you just excuse me 1 minute, please? Thank you, I'm sorry. Yes, if in your study you decide that the people whom you're going to use are just friends and family, that's a convenient sample. So you don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. Any other question, comment? Okay. Dr. Payne, then over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Henry. Yeah, a lot of pieces there. And I think some of these things will maybe possibly become more clear as you are working on, something in a paper, and then one of us will respond to you. So I mean, some of these concepts I know can be a bit abstract until you actually start applying them to your particular situation. So yeah, we'll especially with variables, and of course variables are. Excuse me, I'm going to start coughing too today. A variable, of course, is just anything when one characteristic depends on some other characteristic. You are in entrepreneurialism. There are tests, for example. There are even some standardized tests in terms of an entrepreneurial spirit.
Yes.
Someone actually has what it's going to take to be an entrepreneur.
Yes.
And it'll test, various characteristics of that particular person's personality, experience, etc. Not to say that through some training that couldn't change, but for example, you, Maureen, could do a test to take one of those standardized tests is just to determine that entrepreneurial spirit before you say do a seminar, and then after you've done that seminar, what actually has happened in terms of that entrepreneurial spirit. So that entrepreneurial spirit would be a dependent variable possibly at that point in time, but it's dependent on some other issues in terms of that person's background, personal experience, a lot of different issues that could be factors that were contributing to an entrepreneurial spirit in an individual. So yeah, teen pregnancy itself could be a dependent variable.
Yes.
As you're looking, Noel, at some of the factors, some of the factors that are, let's just call those independent variables. Some of the factors that contributed to a particular situation, a particular woman having a teen pregnancy. So yeah, when we're using, say, that example of a variable, you just kind of think about, what as you're looking at what you're doing, how does one characteristic depend on some other characteristic or some other situation that you're addressing?
Yes.
So yeah, but like I said, I think some of those kinds of concepts start to become more clear as we begin to apply
when you
them.
Get your hand into the dough, as it were. Yes.
Right. Good. Okay, well, I don't have anything else this evening. We'd like us to go ahead and close up on time, if at all possible, since I think it's about 8:45 for most of you in your parts of the world. But anything else you'd like to say? Yeah, I see that your situation is not getting any better, Noel. Fortunately, this session is recorded, so I will post a link. It probably won't get posted till sometime tomorrow. I may get it tonight, but we'll see. But anyway, yeah, it is recorded, so you should be able to listen to this and see the slides again, just to kind of think through some of these concepts. Okay?
Okay.
Well, I think with that, unless there's any other pressing questions, we're going to go ahead and close up the session for tonight.
No, this is not pressing, but I need to ask it.
Go ahead, Maureen.
The paper then, so we need to take it and to extend the information that we have there or to correct it. Because I actually had filled out under the headings of those limitations, delimitations, and so on already.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I know you turned in a fairly complete chapter in your last upload.
So long to finish because I think I was doing too much.
So I think based on what you've heard in this session, you could maybe just kind of go back and see if there's anything you want to add or revise.
I do that, but I recognize what's happening.
Yeah. And I kind of gave you some comments, I think, if I
Yeah,
remember correctly.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Yeah, we're both talking at the same time. Yeah. I'm going to listen now.
Sorry, no, it's fine. It's not a problem.
Okay. All right. Yeah, like I say, you already did that paper. The one thing you would need to do, like I mentioned, is to find 2 articles and go ahead and review those articles and find the problem statement and the research questions. Anyway, that was the assignment for what week 3, week 4. Getting my weeks messed up here, but anyway.
I missed it somewhere along the line, but so this evening I came to class at 4:30 and 7:30.
Right. Okay. Good. Yeah.
Next Monday, I'll be on a train for 23 hours. I'm going from here down to Orlando to come back. So I hope I can link because they say they have Wi-Fi and so on. But if I don't, it's not because I'm running away. So I'm going to expect to be at the class. But if you don't see me or get me, it's because I'm not able.
Understood. Okay. We will hope that you are able to make it, but if not, the recording will be available.
Okay.
Yeah, next week we will start thinking about the literature review chapter, and we'll spend a few weeks on that. So we'll start that next week.
Okay. All right.
All right. With that, I think we'll go ahead and close down and.
Okay. Good evening to everyone.
And good evening to all of you. Yes.
Hope you can hear me. Good evening.